It happened on Christmas night when the house was glowing with lights, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air, and my 7-year-old daughter in her red holiday dress stood beside me with a small wrapped gift she had made for her grandmother, smiling with all the innocent joy children carry so naturally. But my mother, standing tall at the head of the table with every eye on her, looked at my child with cold sharpness and spat out words that burned straight through her heart. Not my granddaughter. Get out. And in that instant, my little girl's smile died. The box slipped from her trembling hands, and tears poured down her cheeks as silence spread across the room like frost on a window, while I felt something inside me twist into a storm so strong I thought the walls themselves might break. If you are listening right now and you know that feeling of seeing someone you love humiliated in front of others, then you understand why I tell these stories. Because every comment, every little sign of support reminds me I am not alone. It helps me keep creating more stories where women stand tall and protect what is theirs. And it may sound small, but I promise it matters. So if this moment touches you, take a second to let me know you are here, because your voice is part of this fight too. My name is Olivia Bennett. I am 33 years old, a nurse by profession and a single mother by life's design. And ever since I gave birth to my daughter, I have carried not only endless love, but also something far stranger, a kind of fire that wakes whenever someone threatens her, an aggression that scares me at times, yet gives me the strength I never knew I had. Because while most mothers speak about gentle patience, I discovered something darker growing with my love, a storm inside me that pushes me to protect, sometimes too fiercely, sometimes in ways I regret, but always in ways that prove my child is the center of my world. That night, I felt that storm press against my ribs, begging me to strike back, to scream, to smash every glass on the table, so my mother's perfect show would collapse into shards. Yet I swallowed it down, lifted my sobbing daughter into my arms, and walked out under the heavy silence of watching relatives. And when I placed her in the car, she whispered, "Why doesn't she love me?" Before her voice cracked into sobs, and as I drove through the falling snow, I knew I could not allow this cycle to continue. So later in our small apartment, after tucking her into bed, I sat at the kitchen table, typed 3 words, and sent them off to the people who would know exactly what to do. And by midnight, when my phone lit up with 37 missed calls from my mother, I did not tremble. I did not scream. I only sent one more message, sharp and final: you'd better start praying. When I carried my daughter out of that house and drove home through the hush of falling snow, my mother's words kept replaying in my head like a cruel holiday carol. Because this was not a single cruel line tossed out in the heat of the moment, but the loudest echo of a pattern that had been building for decades, a slow tightening of pressure that started when I was a teenager and she ridiculed my dreams. When I told her I wanted to study nursing and she rolled her eyes and called it just a job. When I fell in love and she measured my partners like groceries to be put back on the shelf. And later, when life left me raising a child on my own, she turned that fact into a public verdict, a lifelong footnote she announced at family dinners as if it were a badge of shame that everybody should admire. Every holiday became a stage, every gathering a chance for her to remind the room who she thought I was, and because she smiled so well while she did it, people laughed in the wrong places, and I learned to sit very still and make my pain look small so the show could go on. There were many moments that read now like little wounds stitched into a long scar, moments that seemed small at the time, but that collected until they were heavy as a stone, like the time she handed me a check with an invisible string attached and told me I should be grateful, implying I owed my gratitude for the right to breathe the same air as the family. Or the afternoon she corrected my parenting in front of my daughter, suggesting my choices were sloppy and irresponsible, while cousins nodded politely as if rehearsed. And those things ate at me quietly until my voice became something I used only in whispers, because she had a way of making everyone else see me the way she declared I was: difficult, ungrateful, unstable. And more painful than words was how family members learned to accept her framing as truth, offering me pity or silence instead of the defense I needed so many times that I began to doubt my own instincts. My bursts of anger, the strange storm that arrived with motherhood, showed up in the cracks left by that doubt. Sometimes it saved me and sometimes it frightened me, because I would walk into ordinary places with a calm mask and then, at the smallest provocation, find myself doing things I could never have imagined before I had a child to protect. Like the parent-teacher conference when the teacher smirked at a joke about my daughter's messy handwriting and I slammed my hand on the desk until the sound filled the room and everyone went still and my voice came out hard and steady as a verdict. Or the day a neighbor shoved his cart into mine at the grocery store, and I rammed the cart back with an ugly force that left him speechless. Or the time in a church line when an aunt murmured about my temper, and I felt my face go hot and my throat close with an urge to throw every plate within reach. In those moments, the aggression felt like a tool, and also like a danger I could not always control, because it brought a sharp satisfaction when injustice stopped. But it also fed the very story my mother liked to tell about me. And I remember sitting in my car after some of those incidents trembling, not from fear of what others might think, but from the knowledge that inside me there was a power I had never asked for. And that power could either protect my daughter or make me the same kind of person I hated. This Christmas, the cruelty hit in a way that changed everything because it landed on my daughter and not on me. And the feeling of betrayal was not only humiliation, but a revelation. My long silence had taught everyone to accept my mother's voice as authority, and by letting her set the script for how we acted toward one another, I had, in effect, allowed my child to be written out of our family's story, as if bloodlines could be decided by a sneer. So on the drive home, I replayed not only the mocking phrase, but all the small moments that had been folded into it. The gifts given with a ledger hidden inside, the compliments that ended with a cutting clause, the times my mother turned a family gathering into a performance where she was the critic and I the exhibit. And as the storm inside me rose, it felt less wild and more like a sharpened edge of purpose, because anger without direction would only drag me into more chaos, while anger turned into strategy could finally protect my daughter and rewrite the terms of my life. And so I promised myself that the next time family turned cruel in public, I would not be silent. Not because I wanted revenge for revenge's sake, but because I would no longer let someone teach my child to accept small cruelties as normal, and because the strange aggressive thing in me would be honed to guard her dignity, rather than to feed old wounds. The weeks after Christmas did not bring peace, but instead carried the same bitter taste of humiliation that had been simmering for years, because my mother had a gift for turning small family matters into stages where she was the star, and she kept using those stages to paint me as weak, unworthy, and out of control. And I realized she had been laying the groundwork long before that night. So when she struck with those cutting words about my daughter, the room already knew the script. She was the matriarch whose voice was never questioned, and I was the unstable one who should be pitied but not defended. And in the silence of that frozen dining room, her narrative was confirmed for every guest sitting with their eyes averted, too polite or too frightened to intervene. The more I replayed it, the more I saw how she had stacked the deck against me with years of whispered remarks and exaggerated stories. Like the time she told cousins that I once attacked a teacher when all I had done was slam my hand on a desk to stop a cruel joke. Or the time she mentioned at a barbecue that I destroyed a man's car in rage, when the truth was I had swung my purse hard enough to crack a mirror after he cornered me in a parking lot. And the tragedy of it was that my own moments of uncontrolled aggression, born from a desperate instinct to defend my child or myself, were recycled and retold by my mother as evidence that I was dangerous, unstable, and exactly what she always said I was, which made it easier for people to accept her cruelty as discipline rather than abuse. Living with that reputation became its own prison, because whenever I raised my voice or set a boundary, people smirked knowingly as if to say, "See, there she goes again." And even when my cause was just, I felt my argument lose weight under the shadow of the label she had crafted for me. And this pushed me into a painful corner where I began doubting myself, questioning whether the storm inside me was truly protection or if it was proof of my mother's curse upon me, a self-fulfilling prophecy she had planted so deep that no matter how hard I fought to protect my daughter, I risked becoming the monster she already claimed I was. And in that tension, I sometimes broke in ways that frightened me, like snapping at a stranger in a grocery line loud enough to make my daughter cry, and then later sitting alone in the car, ashamed not for defending her, but for losing myself in the fire again. The injustice of it all grew heavier with each day, because while my mother enjoyed her perfect image, attending church socials and chairing charity meetings with pearls at her throat, she left me to clean up the mess of her words, to comfort a child who now asked quietly if she truly belonged, and to manage the weight of a storm inside that made me both strong and dangerous. And I began to see that escalation was no longer about her insults, but about the way she twisted even my defenses into weapons against me. Because if I stayed silent, I betrayed my daughter. Yet if I exploded, I confirmed my mother's story, and so the pressure built like snow on a roof, heavy and silent. And I knew one strong wind would bring the whole structure down, which meant I had to find a way to turn the storm into something sharper, quieter, and controlled. Or else the cycle would bury both me and the only child I had sworn to protect. It was one of those gray January afternoons when the world outside felt heavy with leftover holiday silence, the tree already dragged to the curb, the lights gone, and I was in the kitchen trying to create some order in the small apartment where my daughter and I made our life, dusting shelves and rearranging things that had been untouched for years, when a thick old cookbook tumbled down from the top of the cabinet and fell open across the counter, and out from its stiff yellowed pages slid a plain envelope. No return address, no stamp, only the familiar curve of my grandfather's handwriting in the corner. And my heart stumbled because he had been gone for more than a decade, yet his presence rushed back as if he had walked through the door, and I hesitated before opening it, almost afraid of disturbing something sacred. But curiosity and instinct pulled me forward, and when I unfolded the papers, my breath caught because I was staring at legal documents, a trust written years earlier, and my name was there, clear and deliberate, woven into clauses that spoke of protections, responsibilities, and rights tied not only to me, but to any child of mine. Protections that had been hidden all this time, like a key waiting to be found. The words on the page carried more weight than any weapon I had ever held in my life, because they laid out conditions that were both simple and devastatingly precise. No heir of my grandfather was to be denied belonging. No minor child was to be humiliated publicly without consequence. And if such harm occurred, trustees had the authority to freeze funds, question decisions, and even shift control. And as I read line after line, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, because the storm inside me, the furious instinct that had so often left me shaking after a confrontation, seemed to still itself, almost like a wild animal that suddenly recognizes its leash, because for once I was not powerless. For once my anger did not have to explode in a grocery store or a parking lot to be seen. For once I had in my hands a tool that could not be laughed off or twisted into evidence against me, because paper and signatures carried a different kind of force, one my mother could not dismiss with a sneer. I sat at that table for hours, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, tracing each paragraph with my finger and rereading them until I knew them by heart. and with every repetition, I felt my grandfather's presence stronger, remembering the way he used to watch me at family dinners with eyes that seemed to see beyond the noise, remembering how he slipped me an extra cookie when my mother scolded me for eating too much, remembering how he whispered once, "Keep your head up, Olivia. Storms pass, but dignity lasts." And now I realize that those were not casual words, but a kind of prophecy, because he must have seen what my mother was even then. He must have known how she would twist power to break me, and so he wrote into stone a counterweight, a safeguard that would outlive him, and I could almost hear his voice urging me not to waste it, not to throw it away in another burst of fury, but to steady myself and use it with patience, because this was not a weapon for chaos, but for justice. And in that moment, my chest filled with a warmth I had not felt in years, a mixture of love, grief, and fierce resolve. The longer I held those papers, the more my mind spun with what it could mean, because this was not just about inheritance or money, it was about reputation, control, and the image my mother had built her whole life around, the perfect matriarch whose authority was untouchable. And the irony made me smile through the sting of tears, because the very words she had thrown at my daughter like knives, not my granddaughter, were now the words that might cut her own power to ribbons, since by speaking them she had triggered the exact clause that could strip her of access to what she valued most. And I realized how poetic justice sometimes is. Not loud, not violent, but quiet and written long ago by a man who wanted to protect his granddaughter even after death. And I leaned back in my chair, the coffee beside me gone cold, the sky outside darkening into evening. And for the first time I felt calm in a way that was not hollow but solid. Calm like a blade resting in its sheath, ready to be drawn with precision, and I whispered to myself that the storm inside me had finally found its direction, and I promised that I would not waste it, because now I had more than fury. I had proof, and that changed everything. The morning after I discovered my grandfather's trust documents, I sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the neat stack of papers that now seemed to breathe with their own quiet power. And unlike all the other mornings when I woke up weary from carrying the weight of humiliation and endless battles with my mother, this morning felt electric. My body alive with a steady current that sharpened my focus and cleared the fog that had clung to me for years, because I knew I was no longer cornered. I was no longer the powerless daughter forced to endure her mother's stage performances. I was a woman with a key in her hand, and the storm inside me, which so often erupted without control, had finally calmed, not because it was gone, but because it was listening, waiting for me to give it a direction that mattered. And as I sipped my coffee, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to fight with precision rather than chaos, to let her feel the cut of truth instead of the slap of my anger, and the thought alone filled me with a strength I had never tasted before. I pulled my phone close and typed a single message to 3 names I had seen listed at the end of the trust: the attorney who had executed my grandfather's wishes, the accountant who had filed the trust's annual reports, and the bank officer who controlled the accounts. And though my fingers trembled slightly from the enormity of the step I was about to take, my mind was crystal clear, and the words I typed were only 3. Handle them all. Simple, sharp, and loaded with meaning, because I knew these people had been placed in this circle for a reason. They were not random contacts, but chosen allies of my grandfather's foresight, and with those words, I gave them permission to act, to freeze transfers, to review transactions, to prepare formal inquiries, and to quietly shift the balance of control. And as I hit send, I smiled at how quietly revolutions can begin, not with fireworks or broken glass, but with 3 words tapped onto a phone in a small kitchen by a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. And the irony of it made me laugh softly into the empty room. For a while, I just sat there reflecting on how different this felt from every other time my fury had broken loose. Because in the past, when I had been provoked, my body reacted before my brain, slamming carts into rude men at the store, cracking mirrors when a neighbor cornered me, raising my voice so sharp at a teacher that the entire class froze. And in those moments, I always walked away trembling, unsure whether I had defended or merely exploded, ashamed that I had played into the image my mother had painted of me, the reckless daughter who could not control herself. But this morning was not like those mornings, because the fire was still there, burning hotter than ever. Yet instead of spilling everywhere, it sat inside me like molten steel poured into a mold, taking shape, hardening into something I could hold steady. And for the first time in my life, I understood that my anger did not have to be the curse she claimed it was. It could be discipline. It could be the engine that powered focus and strategy. And that realization felt like a gift from my grandfather himself, as if he had left not only the papers, but also the wisdom of how to use them. To anchor that feeling and to remind myself that I was not acting from impulse, but from resolve, I opened a drawer and pulled out an old empty file folder, thick and stiff from disuse, and with a black marker I wrote across the front in bold, uneven letters, Operation Missile No, half laughing at my own joke, half grounding myself in the knowledge that this was not just a fantasy, but a real plan with real consequences. And sliding the documents inside that folder gave me a rush of satisfaction that shouting at my mother never had, because this time the evidence would speak louder than my temper. This time her lies and her cruelty would be measured against clauses she could not dismiss, and I leaned back in my chair with the folder resting on the shelf beside me, listening to the silence of the apartment and realizing it was not an empty silence, but one filled with promise. And I whispered to myself that soon she would understand the difference between power built on fear and power built on truth, because the storm inside me was no longer wild and destructive. It was sharpened and waiting, and when the moment came to unsheath it, my mother would finally see that I had never been her victim. I had only been preparing. By the end of that week, the first ripples of my quiet message began to reach her, though she did not know exactly what was happening yet, only that something in her carefully balanced world was shifting in ways she could not stop, because one morning she walked into the bank expecting her usual polite nods and open access, but instead she was told, with professional calm, that certain transfers were temporarily frozen pending review, and that phrase alone was enough to crack the perfect smile she wore like armor, because for the first time in her life she was not in control, and when the board of the charity she loved to parade as her crown jewel received a discreet request for receipts, she realized the invisible strings she had pulled so easily for decades were tightening around her wrists, and in her panic, she turned to the one person she had always assumed would bow to her voice, me. It began with a single call I ignored while cooking dinner, then another while I bathed my daughter, then 5 more while I folded laundry, and by the time midnight rolled around, my phone showed 37 missed calls from the same number, each one more frantic than the last, and when I finally listened to the voicemails, her voice was no longer the commanding tone of the matriarch, but the trembling plea of a woman terrified of losing everything, begging me to answer, insisting we could talk, warning me not to go too far. And each new message grew more desperate, like a mask slipping piece by piece, until what was left was raw panic, and I sat at the kitchen table listening not with fear but with a strange calmness, because I realized I did not need to shout anymore. I did not need to smash plates or slam doors. My silence was louder than any scream I could have given her. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to enjoy the weight of stillness, the way it filled the room like a quiet friend, and I felt the storm inside me coil tight but steady, not exploding outward, but holding itself like a blade pressed flat against my palm, sharp and ready, because the truth was I had already said everything I needed to say. And when I finally replied, I did not waste words. I did not explain or justify or even raise my voice. I simply typed one line, "You'd better start praying," and pressed send, and the satisfaction that came afterward was unlike any angry outburst I had ever had, because it was not a burst of energy that left me trembling. It was a deep, steady strength, the kind that hummed in my bones and made me feel taller even while sitting down, and I knew in that moment that the balance of power between us had shifted forever. Meanwhile, my daughter slept peacefully in her room, clutching her stuffed bunny, safe and untouched by the chaos outside, and that sight reminded me why this path mattered, because every time before, when I had lashed out in public, she had seen me shaking, red-faced, fighting shadows I could not explain. But tonight she saw none of that. She saw only stability, the kind of steady love she could lean on. And as I turned off my phone and let the calls pile up unanswered, I realized the real transformation was not what was happening to my mother, but what was happening to me, because I was no longer her puppet, no longer her reckless daughter who confirmed her every accusation. I was the calm center of my own storm, and from that moment forward she would have to face me on new terms, not as someone she could shame into silence, but as the woman she had underestimated until the ground crumbled beneath her feet. The following week, the attorney reached out with a calm voice that carried more weight than any lecture my mother had ever given me, and he explained that my grandfather's trust had been activated in ways no one had expected, because the very clause she triggered with her cruel words on Christmas, the clause protecting minor heirs from public humiliation, had now set in motion a formal review, and that meant her role as the shining matriarch who controlled both the narrative and the money was suddenly under question. And as I listened, I felt the storm inside me settle deeper, not roaring but humming like a quiet engine, because it was no longer about what she had said or how she had said it. It was about the cold truth written in ink, and no amount of gossip or charm could erase what my grandfather had carved into law years before. When the accountant began to comb through the records, more cracks appeared, cracks she had covered with glossy smiles and rehearsed lines, because for years she had rounded up donations to the charity she chaired, announcing larger numbers than were ever deposited. And while no one had pressed her before, too dazzled by her presence, too timid to challenge her perfection, now those discrepancies were highlighted under the microscope of the trust review, and it was not criminal yet, but sloppy and dangerous, the kind of negligence that could stain her reputation beyond repair if it reached the wrong ears. And for once she could not dismiss it as jealousy or exaggeration, because the receipts were there in black and white, the sums not matching, the signatures looking rushed, the trail of arrogance finally betraying her. Meanwhile, small whispers began to reach me through the back channels of the community, because the same church ladies who once nodded along to her every word now sent me quiet messages, telling me they remembered times when my mother turned charity into performance, insisting on photographs with children she barely spoke to, demanding her name be printed larger than the donors who had actually funded the events. And as these stories trickled in, I realized that people had seen her flaws all along, but never had the courage to voice them. And now that someone had cracked the door open, their memories came pouring out, building a portrait of a woman who valued applause more than kindness, image more than love. And the irony of it filled me with a kind of grim satisfaction, because for years she had called me unstable, reckless, unworthy. Yet now it was her mask slipping, her weaknesses exposed not by my anger, but by her own habits, her own vanity, her own hunger for control. As I gathered these pieces together, I could almost feel my grandfather's presence in the room, as though he had known this exact moment would come. And I whispered a thank you into the quiet, because he had not only left me a lifeline, but also a mirror to show me what real power looked like, the kind that does not need raised voices or shattered glass to be heard, the kind that comes from patience and truth, and with every document copied, every receipt highlighted, every quiet story shared by someone brave enough to speak, I felt my own storm sharpen further, becoming less of a raging fire and more of a scalpel ready to cut precisely where it hurt most. And I knew with unshakable certainty that my mother had spent her life preparing the stage for herself. But now she was about to be undone on that very same stage by the weight of her own words and the evidence she could no longer bury. The day of the family gathering came with a heaviness in the air, as if even the winter sky understood that something irreversible was about to happen. And I walked into my mother's house, not with shaking hands or fiery rage, but with a quiet folder tucked beneath my arm, a folder labeled in my own handwriting, a folder that held the weight of my grandfather's foresight and the evidence of my mother's carelessness. And as I stepped into that glittering dining room where she had humiliated my daughter only weeks before, I felt the storm inside me stir, not like an uncontrollable blaze, but like a sharpened blade finally drawn from its sheath, steady and ready. And while the cousins glanced up from their seats with cautious curiosity, I gave them nothing but calm, because this time I would not play the role my mother had written for me, the reckless daughter whose voice cracked with emotion. I would play the role of the woman my grandfather had believed in, the woman who knew the power of patience. When the room settled and my mother began her usual performance, trying to charm the table with her polished smile, I waited until the chatter softened, then placed the folder on the table and slid out the trust documents with deliberate care. And the moment her eyes landed on them, her face tightened, the corners of her mouth faltering, because she recognized exactly what they were. And before she could dismiss me, I began to read aloud, my voice steady and low, quoting the very clause that barred any trustee from humiliating a minor heir, explaining that this was not my opinion or exaggeration, but the words of our grandfather, written years before, signed and sealed. And as the room grew quieter with each sentence, I saw heads turn from her to me, watching as the balance shifted, watching as her mask began to slip under the weight of her own actions. And for the first time, I felt the storm inside me not push me toward shouting, but anchor me into stillness, because silence worked harder than rage ever could. To drive the point home, I laid out a few carefully chosen receipts uncovered during the review, nothing overwhelming, just enough to reveal the inconsistencies that had been glossed over for years. Donations that did not match deposits, numbers that slipped conveniently upward when she reported them. And while it was not enough to indict her, it was enough to expose the cracks in her perfect image, enough to remind everyone that her authority rested not on honesty, but on performance. And when the accountant confirmed this with his own statement, her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and I recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look I had seen in my daughter that night on Christmas, the look of someone who suddenly understood that the world had shifted beneath their feet. And though part of me wanted to savor her collapse, to throw every cruel word back in her face, I held the storm back, letting the evidence speak louder than any insult ever could. And because life demands both sharpness and balance, I broke the tension with a touch of irony, pulling from my bag a steaming casserole dish I had made myself and placing it on the table with a small smile, joking lightly that I wanted to make sure no one said I came empty-handed. And the cousins laughed nervously, but the laughter loosened the air just enough, because humor has its own kind of blade. And in that moment, I realized the power of contrast, how even in the middle of exposing my mother's lies, I could still stand with dignity, still remind everyone that I was not the monster she had painted me to be. I was a mother protecting her child, a granddaughter honoring her grandfather, and a woman reclaiming her rightful place at the table. And as I sat back and watched her struggle to compose herself, I knew this was only the beginning of her unraveling, because the truth had been spoken aloud, and there was no way to put it back into silence. When the meeting broke for coffee and murmurs filled the room, the attorney quietly pulled another envelope from his briefcase and slid it across to me, his expression careful, almost reverent, and he said it contained a letter my grandfather had written long ago, but sealed to be revealed only if the trust's protective clause was triggered. And as I unfolded the paper and scanned the neat script, my breath caught, because it was not just legal language this time. It was his voice speaking across years, telling me why he had created those safeguards in the first place. And as my eyes moved down the page, the storm inside me shifted, no longer boiling with anger, but trembling with recognition, because he wrote of how he had watched my mother humiliate not only me, but also someone before me. A hidden story about a sister she once drove out of the family, a sister I never knew existed, pushed away in shame when she became inconvenient to the family image. And suddenly, the cruelty I had suffered all my life felt like part of a much older pattern, a cycle repeating itself across generations. The more I read, the more my chest tightened, because my grandfather explained that he had feared history would repeat, that the wound my mother carried from being raised under a cruel woman herself had made her hard, and that hardness had turned into pride, and that pride had turned into cruelty, until the line between protecting her image and destroying those who threatened it blurred beyond recognition. And in his letter, he pleaded with whoever held it in the future to break the cycle, to remember that family was not bloodlines or performances, but kindness, dignity, and truth. And I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder as if he were sitting beside me, urging me not to let anger consume me completely, warning me that while fury might win a battle, it would never heal a wound. And reading those words made me realize that the fire I carried inside was the very thing that could either repeat her mistakes or finally end them. Still, knowing her cruelty came from her own brokenness did not erase the years she had robbed from me or the tears she had carved into my daughter's face. And I felt the storm inside me rise again, because empathy does not erase accountability, and while I could acknowledge the pain she carried from her past, I would not allow it to excuse what she had done, because everyone has a choice in how they carry their scars, and she had chosen to weaponize hers against her own child and grandchild, and that decision was hers alone, not her mother's, not her past's, and not the world's. And so as I folded the letter back into its envelope, I told myself that mercy would come, but only after the truth had done its work, only after she stood naked in the eyes of those she had deceived for so long, because only then could forgiveness have meaning. When I returned to the dining room, I looked at my mother with new eyes, seeing not only the woman who had sneered at my daughter, but also the broken girl she once was, the girl who had been told she was not enough, the girl who had learned to survive by controlling others. And for a brief moment, I felt the strange duality of anger and pity clash inside me. But then I glanced at my daughter, who was quietly coloring in the corner, her small shoulders tense as if she still feared the next cruel word, and I knew exactly where my loyalty belonged. So I straightened my back, slid the letter into my folder, and prepared to demand the one thing my grandfather had asked for in his letter: a public apology, specific and undeniable, not whispered in private, not hidden behind excuses, but spoken aloud where everyone could hear, because only that kind of truth could stop the cycle from passing into another generation, and I swore to myself that I would see it through no matter how much she begged. The day of the church gathering arrived, a community event my mother normally would have floated through like royalty, head held high, pearls gleaming, every smile rehearsed to perfection. But this time she looked smaller when she entered the hall, her shoulders stiff as if the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her, and I sat near the front with my daughter, the folder on my lap a silent reminder of everything that had led us here. and when the meeting reached the point of announcements, I stood and with a voice calm and clear, asked my mother to join me at the podium. And the silence that followed was heavy, because the people in that room had known her as the unshakable matriarch for decades. Yet now they watched as she hesitated, her hand trembling slightly on the back of a chair before she finally stepped forward. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear written openly across her face. I opened the envelope my grandfather had left and read aloud a short passage, the one where he insisted that no child in his bloodline should ever be humiliated publicly, that any act of cruelty must be followed by public acknowledgement and apology. And as the words echoed through the hall, I felt the storm inside me rumble, urging me to spit back every insult she had ever given me, to scream about the years of shame and silence. But I held it back, because I realized the documents themselves, combined with the eyes of the community, carried a sharper edge than anything my voice could deliver. And I turned to my mother and told her simply that this was her moment, her chance to speak not as the perfect image she had built, but as a woman who had broken something sacred. And the room grew so still I could hear the faint shuffle of paper programs as she lowered her head and began. Her voice was shaky at first, brittle in a way I had never heard, and she stumbled over the words, trying to find her old rhythm. But the weight of the letter and the pressure of so many witnesses forced her past performance and into honesty, and she said the words I had waited decades to hear, naming what she had done that Christmas, admitting that she had looked at her own granddaughter and denied her, confessing that it was cruel and wrong, and for a moment I thought the roof itself would creak with the tension as people gasped softly and exchanged glances, because they had never heard her falter before, never seen the flawless mask crack. And though a part of me longed to revel in her humiliation, the stronger part of me, the mother in me, felt something release deep inside, because I knew my daughter, standing at my side with her hand curled in mine, was finally hearing the truth spoken aloud, and no sneer, no whisper, no rumor could erase that moment. When she finished, her shoulders sagged, her hands clutched the podium as if she might fall, and I nodded once, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had carried pain long enough and was finally setting it down, and the room erupted in the kind of awkward applause that carries both shock and relief. And I looked at my daughter, who for the first time since Christmas held her head high, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and disbelief, and I squeezed her hand gently to tell her without words that this was what justice looked like. Not revenge dripping with fury, but dignity standing tall. And later, as people lined up for coffee and cookies, one of the older women from the choir who had once looked at me with suspicion came over with a soft smile and asked for my recipe for ginger cookies. And I laughed, realizing how much had shifted in a single afternoon, because sometimes the greatest victories are not shouted from rooftops, but lived quietly in the way people finally look at you differently. And in that moment, I felt both lighter and stronger, knowing that my mother's apology had not erased the past, but had written a new truth that no one could ever take away from my daughter again. In the days that followed her public apology, the shift in our family was almost tangible, like the air itself had changed weight, because people no longer looked at me as the unstable daughter who couldn't control her temper. They looked at me as the one who had stood steady in the storm and carried the truth into the open, and for the first time their eyes carried respect rather than pity. And I realized the balance of power was no longer tilting against me, but settling firmly in my hands, not because I had shouted the loudest, but because I had endured, waited, and finally struck at the right moment with precision. And in that quiet victory, I felt taller, steadier, more certain than I had ever felt before. My mother, once so loud and commanding, now moved carefully in rooms where she used to stride, her words chosen more softly, her eyes avoiding mine, and though part of me longed to enjoy her smallness, I reminded myself that true strength was not about gloating, but about setting boundaries that could not be broken again. When the trustees met to review the outcome, I was officially named co-trustee alongside the attorney, a position that came with both responsibility and control. And while I had no interest in chasing money or lording power over anyone, I accepted because it meant my daughter's place was secured, her dignity written into law as much as into memory. And sitting at that polished table signing the forms, I felt something deep inside shift. The storm that once frightened me now felt like energy channeled into steel, strong and contained, something I could draw from without drowning in it. And I thought about all the times I had lost my temper and been used as proof of weakness. And I smiled quietly, because now that same fire was my greatest strength, transformed into discipline, into strategy, into a force no one could twist against me again. At home, I spoke to my daughter in simple words she could carry, telling her that love does not depend on someone else's approval, that family is not defined by who sneers at you across a dinner table, but by who protects you when you are most vulnerable. And she nodded slowly, her young eyes carrying a wisdom beyond her years. And then she smiled and asked if that meant Grandma would be nicer now. And I held her close and told her, maybe. But whether she changed or not didn't matter anymore, because we had built our own circle, one that no one could erase. And the relief I saw in her small body as she relaxed against me was more rewarding than any victory in front of relatives, because I knew I had broken the cycle. And she would grow up not with silence or shame, but with an example of how to fight with dignity. And because life is not just about battles, but also about connection, I want to pause here and tell you something from the heart. If you've been listening and this story has touched you, if you've ever had to stand up for yourself or someone you love, then please take a moment to like this story or leave a comment, because your support means more than I can ever explain. It tells me I am not speaking into emptiness. It helps me keep creating stories like this, and it builds a small but powerful circle of people who believe in standing tall, even when life tries to break you. Every click, every word you leave behind is a reminder that none of us are truly alone in our storms, and I am deeply grateful for it. Weeks stretched into months, and then months slowly folded into a new season. And while life did not magically erase the pain of the past, it settled into a steadier rhythm that felt like healing, the kind of quiet change that lingers beneath the surface until one day you notice you can finally breathe without the weight pressing on your chest. My mother, once the woman who commanded every holiday with an iron smile, seemed to shrink within herself, no longer sweeping into rooms with the confidence of a queen, but stepping carefully, quietly, as though afraid of the echoes her words might create. She resigned from her position at the charity board where she had once reigned, offering an excuse about her health, but everyone knew it was not illness that pushed her away. It was exposure, and for the first time she was left to sit in the back rows rather than the front, folding clothes at donation drives and serving food in silence, her pearls traded for plain sweaters, her voice lowered to a murmur. Whether this new humility was genuine repentance or only shame trying to survive, I could not tell, and I realized it no longer mattered, because her story was no longer mine to carry, and her choices were no longer written across my skin. For me, the true transformation was not about her fall, but about my rise, because I finally learned that the storm I had spent years fearing was not a flaw, but a kind of fire, one that could consume if left unchecked, but could also illuminate if guided with discipline. I used the scholarship my grandfather had buried within the trust, a gift activated only when I proved courage, to enroll in a leadership program at the hospital. And though sitting in classrooms again at 33 felt strange at first, I carried myself differently, with the quiet strength of a woman who had survived both humiliation and silence. And every page I studied, every presentation I gave, felt like proof that the fire inside me had finally been shaped into steel. My colleagues began to notice, asking for my input, treating me not as a background nurse, but as someone whose voice mattered. And with each step forward, I carried my daughter's image in my mind, because everything I built was not only for myself, but for her. A living testament that anger does not have to be shameful, that scars can be turned into shields, and that women like us do not have to remain victims of any one stage. At home, the changes bloomed in smaller, softer ways that mattered most. My daughter grew brighter with every passing week, her voice stronger, her laughter freer, and I noticed how she began to walk into rooms without hesitation, as if the shadow of rejection no longer clung to her shoulders. We created our own traditions that had nothing to do with approval or performance: Saturday pancake breakfasts in pajamas, silly dance contests in the living room, painting cheap ornaments together with glitter that clung to everything. And when the next Christmas came, we decorated our own small tree with lights that flickered unevenly but warmly, and together we painted a wooden ornament that read, "We belong." Hanging it on the tree felt like writing our own chapter in a family book that could no longer be edited by anyone else. My daughter looked at it proudly and whispered that she finally felt like the house was really ours, and my chest filled with a satisfaction deeper than any applause I had ever chased in my mother's home. And perhaps the sweetest victory was found in the ordinary, in the moments that seemed so simple, yet carried the weight of everything we had fought for. On Christmas Eve, instead of dry turkey carved at a table where sneers hid behind smiles, we ordered pizza, curled up under blankets, and watched holiday movies that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. Cocoa steaming in our mugs, and snow falling softly outside. It was not perfect, it was not polished, but it was real, and it was ours. In that warmth, I finally understood the moral that had carried me through. Never mistake cruelty for love. Never bow to the chains of family when they are forged from shame, because real family is built from kindness and courage, not performance and control. Storms may rage, tempers may rise, but if you learn to guide that fire, it can light the way instead of burning you down. And with that truth carved deep into my heart, I close this chapter of my life not with bitterness, but with peace, knowing that my daughter and I had broken the cycle, and that no one, not even my mother, could ever again decide where we belonged. So if this story touched your heart even a little, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me what you felt in the comments. I read every word you share, and it means the world to know these stories matter to someone out there. Your support is what keeps me writing and gives me the strength to bring more of these true-to-life moments to you. Don't just listen quietly. Let me know you're here with me, because together we're building a place where no one has to face their storm alone.